Hey everyone, welcome back to Storytime. I hope you enjoyed our mammoth session on Monday of Little Pilgrim's Progress. But we're going to continue today with another lovely big chunk of Little Pilgrim's Progress and of course a devotion from Indescribable. So get yourself comfy because we've got a few more chapters that we are going to read. We are going to start at chapter 79. And it is called The Great Dragon. Next to the city of Vanity Fair was a large forest, and in this forest lived a terrible dragon. It was a fierce and cruel creature, and the people were very much afraid of it. It was so bold that it often came into the midst of the town and attacked both men and women, and sometimes it seized little children and carried them away to its den. The servants of the wicked prince hated this dragon, but none of them were brave enough to resist it. When they heard its roaring, they fled away and tried to hide themselves, so that the savage creature grew more and more bold in its attacks upon them. But the servants of the king had made up their minds to destroy it if they could, and when they heard that Great Heart was staying at the house of Mason, they determined to ask him to go out with them. Great Heart was very willing to help them, and one morning the little party went forth in search of the dragon. It came out of the forest to meet them, and did not seem to be in the least afraid of them. Indeed, it was so strong that it could easily have killed them all if they'd not been armed with the king's weapons. However, they fought against it with all their might, and although they were not able to hurt it much in the first battle, they drove it back to its den. There it lay for several days, angry and frightened, and did not venture to approach the city. While Great Heart stayed in Vanity Fair, he went out 3 or 4 times with the king's servants to fight the dragon, and before he left the city, they succeeded in wounding it, so that much of its strength and power were lost. You may be sure that the townspeople were very glad when they knew this, and that even the wicked men could not help honouring Great Heart and his companions for their bravery. At last, the time came for the pilgrims to continue their journey. Their friends were very sorry to part from them and gave them many presents. Grace and Martha, Mason's 2 daughters, had been waiting for a guide to take them to the celestial city, so their father asked Great Heart whether he would allow them to tarry with Christiana. Great Heart answered that it would be very pleasant for them to do so. Many of the king's servants came to the gates of the city to bid the pilgrims farewell, and Christiana could not help thinking how good the king had been in making everyone be kind to her and her companions. "We might have been treated no better than Christian and Faithful were," she said to Mercy. "I was really very much afraid that we should be put in prison. But you see, we have found friends even here, and the king has kept us safely in the midst of this wicked city." The beautiful Valley of Peace was only a day's journey from Vanity Fair, and the pilgrims spent the next night in the quiet meadows. In the morning, Great Heart told Christiana that the king had built a house in this valley, where the baby pilgrims were nursed and taught by kind and good women until they were old enough to travel to the celestial city. "Do you mean that I ought to leave Innocence there?" asked Christiana. "It will be wise for you to do so," answered Great Heart. "She is too young to spend all day in travelling, and you know how hard the path is for her tender little feet." "But I can carry her," said Christiana. "Not all the way," said Great Heart very gently, for he saw the tears in the girl's eyes. "I'm sure you love Innocence, don't you?" "Yes. The king loves her even more than you do, and he thinks it is better for his little ones to gain strength and wisdom in this quiet valley before they set out on their journey." "Shall I have to go into the city without her? I thought we should all pass through the gates together." "No, the king generally sends for his pilgrims one by one. Innocence will very likely come to live with you in the land of delight. But even if you have to cross the river without her, you need not be troubled, for you may be quite sure that she is safe and happy. I will take you today to see the king's house." Poor Christiana felt very sad, but she loved the king too well to disobey him. And when she'd seen the kind women who nursed the little pilgrims, and the sunny rooms and the beautiful garden in which they lived, she grew more content. The next day she carried Innocence across the meadow and led her up a pathway to the door of the king's house. A gentle-looking nurse came out to meet her, and Christiana said, "I have brought my little sister, for Greatheart thinks she's too young to travel any farther with us." The nurse saw the tears in Christiana's eyes, and she answered, "You do not like to part with her." "No, I have no other sister, and I thought we should always be together." "Dear little girl," said the nurse, "I do not wonder that you love her. She will be very happy here, and it will not be long before she is strong enough to follow you." Then she took Innocence in her arms and asked Christiana to come into the house with her. Christiana stayed there all day, and in the evening, when she'd seen Innocence sleeping peacefully in her little cot, she went back again through the valley to the place where the other children were staying. Greatheart came part of the way to meet her, and he was so kind and gentle that Christiana felt comforted. "I know the king's servants will teach her better than I can," she said, "and the path is very rough sometimes." "Yes," replied Greatheart, "and you cannot carry her always. It is right that she should learn to walk alone. When you see her again, you will feel very glad that you turned her into the care of the king." Then he told Christiana and the king's son, the good prince whom they all loved so dearly, came very often to see the children, and spent much of his time in teaching them and leading them up and down in the broad meadows. When they are tired, he carries them tenderly in his arms. When the little pilgrims reached the stile that led into Bypath Meadow, they saw the stone that Christian and Hopeful had placed by the wayside. The children were tired from walking, for the part of the road was very rough, so they sat down to rest for a little while and soon began to talk about the dreadful giant Despair. "Why does not someone kill him?" said Joseph. "We're not strong enough, are we?" said James, looking at Greatheart. "But you could kill the biggest giant, couldn't you?" Greatheart smiled. "Only with the help of the king," he answered, "and the king would help if you trusted in him." "So that we could kill even giant Despair?" "Yes." "Let us try," exclaimed Joseph eagerly. He was very cruel to little Christian. "Perhaps there are some pilgrims shut up in the castle now," said Mercy. "But it is not wrong to leave. Is it not wrong to leave the way of the king?" asked Christiana. "If the boys really wish to fight with giant Despair, the king will not be displeased," answered Greatheart. "Christian and Hopeful went into the meadow for their own leisure, and so they fell into trouble." "Then do you think we may go?" asked Matthew. "Yes, if you are ready to fight like brave soldiers." The boys were only too eager to follow Greatheart to Doubting Castle, and old Mr. Honest said that he must certainly go with them. So they stayed by the wayside with Christiana and the other girls. The boys were only too eager to follow Greatheart to Doubting Castle, and old Mr. Honest said that he must certainly go with them. Feeble-minded and ready to halt would not have been able to fight, so they stayed by the wayside with Christiana and the other girls. The little party was soon out of sight, and it was quite late in the day when they returned. They were full of triumph, and they brought 2 pilgrims with them, whom they had rescued from the cruel giant. One was an old man with a sad and weary face. He'd been lying for many weeks in a dark dungeon, and even the grey evening light seemed to dazzle his weak eyes. He looked pale and faint, and when he'd been brought safely into the way of the king, he had to lie upon the grass, while Christiana and her friends rubbed his cold hands and fed him with wholesome bread and wine. Presently he revived a little and was able to sit up and thank his deliverers. He told them that his name was Despondency and that he'd been travelling to the Celestial City with his daughter, much afraid. The poor girl had done her best to comfort her father in his distress, but they'd both lost all hope of being saved and could scarcely believe that Greatheart was a servant of the king and that they were really free once more. "Did you kill the giant?" whispered Mercy to Matthew. "Yes, and his wife too. She was very cruel, and she deserved to die as well as her husband. Oh, Mercy, the castle was such a dreadful place." "I'm glad we did not fall into the giant's hands," said Mercy. "That poor girl looks as if she would die even now. So she will soon grow stronger if we take care of her." "Did you destroy the castle?" "We broke down all the gates and doors." "You must have been frightened at the giant." "He was very rough and savage, but we prayed to the king, and even little Joseph fought bravely. It was our first real battle." And the lad's eyes shone as he put his sword back into its sheath. Greatheart had now quite a large party of pilgrims under his care. Good Mr. Honest took charge of Mr. Despondency, and, much afraid, although she was older than any of the other girls, was very glad of their pleasant company. The shepherds, who lived upon the Delectable Mountain, saw the pilgrims coming towards their tents and were very pleased to find that Greatheart was with them. All the king's servants knew and loved him, for he was such a great and faithful guide. It was a clear, bright night, but as Despondency and his daughter were so weak after their long imprisonment, Greatheart thought it wise to remain with the shepherds until the next day. These kind men welcomed the whole party to their tents, gave them food and prepared beds for them, so that in the morning they rose up refreshed and strengthened. The shepherds were always very glad when any of the king's pilgrims came to stay with them, and they liked to take their visitors to see the view of the Celestial City and the many strange places upon the mountains. Christiana and her friends enjoyed their walk upon the hills very much, and when they'd seen all the wonderful sights that had been shown to Christian and Hopeful, there was still a little time to spare before they continued their journey. So instead of turning back to the tents, the shepherds led the pilgrims to a very beautiful hill called Mount Innocence. Not far from where they stood, a man was walking upon a green slope. He was clothed in white, and his garments had not a single spot or stain upon them. But while the pilgrims watched him, 2 other men came across the mountain, and they saw the man's white robes. They filled their hands with earth and began to pelt him with it. "Oh," cried the children, "they will spoil his beautiful clothes." "No," said the shepherd, "the king will prevent that." And as the man came nearer, the pilgrim saw that the dirt, although it struck his clothes, fell from them without leaving the slightest stain. "There's a lesson in that," said Mr. Honest. "Yes," said Greatheart, "a very good lesson to all pilgrims. When wicked people speak evil of them, they need not be unhappy, for the king will not allow false words to do them any real harm. And you may remember also," said the shepherds, "that it is only by your own fault that the clothes that the king gives us can be stained. None of our enemies have any power to spoil them." After this, the shepherds took their visitors to Mount Charity. A good man lived there whose work was to provide garments for some of the king's servants who were very poor indeed. He showed the pilgrims a wonderful roll of cloth that the king had given him to use. Every day he cut from it as many garments as were needed, and yet the cloth never came to an end. "It is very strange," said Christiana as she watched the man at his work. "The king's power and goodness are so wonderful," said the shepherds. "Those who really try to help his poor servants may be sure that their stores will never fail." Although the shepherds lived in tents during the summer, they also had a large and beautiful house which the king had given into their care in order that it might be used as a place to rest for his pilgrims. When the children returned from their walk up the mountain, they found dinner prepared for them in this house, and as soon as the meal was over, Great Heart desired them to get ready for their journey. Mercy had eaten very little dinner, and she looked so pale and sad that Christiana whispered, "What is the matter, Mercy? Are you ill?" Tears came into Mercy's eyes, but she shook her head and said nothing. "What is it?" asked Christiana. "Don't cry. Tell me what is troubling you." "It isn't right for me to wish for things," said Mercy with a little sob, "but you have your beautiful anchor, and I saw something just now that I should so like to have." "What did you see? Perhaps it's something that we may ask for." "It is a glass in the dining room. I looked at it before dinner. You can see yourself in it, but when you turn it around, you don't see yourself any more, but our dear prince instead. It is so beautiful. There is a crown of thorns upon his head, and he seemed to smile at me, and I feel as if I could not be happy unless I had it." Christiana felt puzzled. "The shepherds are very kind," she said. "Perhaps if they knew you wished for it, they might be willing to let us have it." "I could buy it, you know," said Mercy. "I have a little money." "Well, don't cry any more. I will ask the shepherds about it." So Mercy dried her tears, and in a few moments Experience came towards her. He spoke very gently and laid his kind hand kindly on her shoulder. "Christiana has said that you have seen something in our house that you would like to have for your own. Tell me what it is, and the king will be very glad that we should give it to you." Shy little Mercy blushed very much, but she looked up at the shepherd and answered, "It is the glass in the dining room in which you can see the prince." Sincere had followed Experience, and when he heard what Mercy said, he went at once into the house and brought out the glass. Mercy scarcely knew what to say when it was placed in her hands, but the shepherd saw how timid she was, and they understood quite well that she was too happy and grateful for many words. Then these kind men brought out their treasures, I'm having trouble reading this evening. These kind men brought out of their treasures a present for each of the pilgrims, and after wishing them a pleasant journey, they watched the little party until all were out of sight. You remember that Christian and Hopeful received a map of the country, and that the shepherds gave them directions. Christiana and her companions did not need any map, because Great Heart was with them, and he knew the way of the king, and could warn the pilgrims when they came to any dangerous places. When Christian and Hopeful were travelling together, Christian had told his friend the story of little Faith, who had foolishly laid down to sleep by the wayside and had been robbed by some wicked boys. Great Heart and the pilgrims came presently to that very place where little Faith had slept. It was at the corner of a lane which led out of the way of the king into the country of the wicked prince. As they drew near, they saw a man standing alone, with his sword in his hand and his armour stained with blood. Great Heart stopped and asked him what had happened. The man was tall and strong, with a brave, handsome face, and as Christiana looked at him, she felt sure that she had seen him before. "My name is Valiant," he answered, "and I am a pilgrim. 3 men came down this lane and attacked me as I was passing. They said I might take my choice of 3 things, either to join them in robbing the king's pilgrims, or to go back to my own city, or to be put to death on the spot." "What did you say to them?" asked Great Heart. "I told them that I had always tried to be honest, and I certainly should not become a thief now, and that, as for my own city, I should not have left it if I had been happy there. But it was a bad place, and I had forsaken it forever. Then they asked me if I wished to lose my life, and I said my life was worth too much for me to give up lightly, and that they had no right to meddle with the king's servants in such a manner. So they drew their swords, and I drew mine, and we have been fighting for nearly 3 hours. They've wounded me, but I think I wounded them also, and I suppose they must have heard your steps in the distance, although I did not, for they suddenly turned and fled away. Then I saw you coming." "That was a hard battle, 3 men to 1, said Greatheart. "Yes," replied Valiant, "but I knew I was fighting against my king's enemies, and that gave me courage." "Did you not cry for help? Some of the king's servants might have been near enough to hear you." "I cried to the king himself, and I'm sure he answered me. I could not have fought so long in my own strength." Greatheart smiled. "You are one of the king's true servants." "Let me see your sword," said Valiant. "No man who has such a weapon need be afraid, if he has learned how to use it skillfully." "And you fought for 3 hours," said Greatheart. "Were you not ready to faint with fatigue?" "No, I fought until my sword clung to my hand, as if it were a part of my arm, but I think that made me feel stronger." "You have been very brave," answered Greatheart. "You must finish your journey with us. We shall all be glad of your company." Mr. Honest, Mr. Despondency, and the children all joined in welcoming the brave soldier. Christiana washed her wounds, and Mercy and Phoebe helped her bind them up. After this they brought him food and wine and made him rest for a little while. Then, as evening was coming on, they started once more on their journey. Christiana was walking just behind Greatheart and Mr. Valiant, and she could hear all that the soldier said in answer to the questions of the young guide. She was still wondering where she had seen him before, when she heard him say that he had once lived in the City of Destruction. "What made you become a pilgrim?" asked Greatheart. "I had a little son," replied Valiant, "and when he knew that his mother was living with the king, he never rested until he found out how to follow her. He went away one morning, and we did not miss him until it was too late for us to overtake him and bring him back." "What was his name?" asked Greatheart, and Christiana listened eagerly for the answer, for she felt sure now that she knew who the soldier was. "Christian," he answered. "I was very grieved when I heard what had happened, and it was many months before we had any certain news of him. Then a man named Truth came to the city, and he met me one day and told me how my brave little boy had travelled safely along the way of the king and had reached the dark river and crossed it, and had been received by the shining ones at the gate of the celestial city. He told me also that the child and his mother were living happily in the presence of the king, and when I heard this, I began to feel restless and sad. The service of the wicked prince was no longer pleasant to me, and I forsook him and became a pilgrim." "Did you come in at the wicket gate?" "Yes, for Truth had told me that I could not be received by the king unless I did so." Greatheart turned around and looked at Christiana with a smile. "You see," he said, "the king has fulfilled little Christian's wish." Then Valiant turned also. "Did you know my little boy?" he asked. Christiana answered with tears in her eyes, for she knew how the child had longed for his father to follow him. "Ah," said Valiant, "it will give him great pleasure when he comes to the gates of the city and finds so many of his friends are waiting to enter." Greatheart and the soldier went on talking for some time, and Christiana listened to Valiant's account of his pilgrimage. He'd always been very brave and diligent in his work, so that his master, the wicked prince, had been very unwilling to lose so good a servant. His companions had done everything they could to keep him at his post in the City of Destruction, and they tried to frighten him by telling him of the dangers he would meet if he became a pilgrim. They told him of the fierce giants and the lions and the hill of difficulty, of the enchanted ground and the net of the flatterer, and of the dark river over which there was no bridge and which must be passed before he could enter the celestial city. They reminded him also of the many pilgrims who had gladly returned to their homes after entering a long distance upon the way of the king. And they denied that the story of his little son's happiness was a true one, for they knew that he had certainly been lost in the dark river and never reached the opposite shore at all. "Did not all of these things discourage you?" asked Greatheart. "No," replied Valiant. "I felt that Truth could not possibly be deceiving me, so I left the city and began my journey." And have you not been sorry?" "No, indeed. I have met with many enemies, but I have trusted in the king, and he has helped me to conquer them all." Although the enchanted ground was a pleasant place in which pilgrims were tempted to rest after the toils of their journey, they sometimes found the path across it full of difficulty and trouble. The air was so warm and still that it made everyone feel sleepy, and the servants of the wicked prince had built many little arbours in the hope that foolish pilgrims would lie down to rest in them and so fall into the hands of their enemies. They'd also been planted a number of briars close to the way of the king, and these had flourished so well that their long prickly branches were trailing all over the pathway, and Christiana and her companions had to pick their way among them very carefully indeed. There had been a heavy storm of rain in the early morning, which had left the path so wet. Between the mud and the thorns, the poor children began to feel quite faint and discouraged. Great Heart and Mr. Valiant did their best to cheer the weary little company. Great Heart went first and made Feeble Mind lean upon his arm, and Mr. Valiant came last of all, leading Mr. Despondency, who was still weak and unable to get on comfortably by himself. Soon they passed by a large and beautiful arbour, and I think if the children had been alone, they might have been tempted to enter it. The walls were neatly made, and the roof had been covered that morning with fresh green boughs, which made it look cool and pleasant. But the pilgrims had learned to trust their wise young guide, and he had warned them that they must not think of sleeping until they'd safely crossed this dangerous plain. Night came on while they were in the middle of the enchanted ground, and this made travelling more difficult, for the air was damp and foggy, and the moon was not shining. However, Great Heart led them slowly along, and presently he desired them to stand still for a few minutes. "We're coming to a place where several paths lead out of the way of the king," said he, "and it is so dark I must look carefully at my map, or we may turn out of the road and be lost." He struck a light and drew out his little map, and as he looked before him at the path, he saw a pit filled with mud, which the wicked soldiers had dug just where the pilgrims would have to pass. If they had gone on in the darkness, one of them would be sure to fall into it, and might have been smothered before anyone could have drawn them out. Not far from the pit was another arbour, and in it lay 2 pilgrims sleeping soundly. These were lads about Matthew's age, and as Great Heart looked at them, he said, "We must try to awaken them." But although he called them by their names, for he knew who they were, they did not hear him, and at last he took them by the shoulders and shook them. This roused them a little, and one of them murmured, "I will pay you when I get some money," and the other said, "I will fight as long as I can hold my sword." Then they settled themselves to sleep again. Great Heart turned away, for he saw that they could not be awakened. "What did they mean?" asked Christiana. "They did not know what they were saying," he answered. "They're in the power of the wicked prince, and he will not let them understand the danger until it is too late for them to escape from it." Oh my goodness. It's coming to the end. You're going to have to join me on Friday to find out what happens. The final few chapters of Little Pilgrim's Progress. Okay, our devotion is called, let me turn to the correct page, Rocking the Waves. What kind of man is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. And that comes from Mark chapter 4 verse 41. Waves are basically our planet's circulation system. They keep the ocean's water constantly on the move. Even though the oceans make up more than 70% of our planet's surface, the water in them doesn't stay in one spot. Some waves are tiny, so tiny that you can barely see them. They're called ripples. Other waves, like rogue waves, can be more than 100 feet tall and can sink even the biggest ships. The top of the wave is called the crest, while the bottom is called the trough. Most waves are created by winds. But they can also be created by underwater currents, earthquakes, landslides under the water, or even underwater eruptions of volcanoes. Jesus knows a thing or two about waves. After all, he made them. And once, when he and his disciples were in a boat on the Sea of Galilee, a storm with huge waves hit. Jesus had fallen asleep, but when the waves started crashing over the boat, the terrified disciples hurried to wake him up. Jesus got up and simply said, "Be still." And the wind and the waves stopped. The disciples were amazed and a little frightened. What kind of man could do that? The answer is only Jesus, because even though he was fully human, he was fully God at the same time. That means he had every bit of God's power and strength to command all things. So the next time you're in the middle of a terrifying storm, whether it's a storm of wind and waves or a storm of trouble, run to Jesus. He will see you safely through any kind of storm. Be amazed. Tsunamis can be deadly. Caused by underwater earthquakes or volcanic eruptions, these waves start out small at only a few inches high. But as they get closer and closer to land, they can build up to be more than 1,500 feet high. Lord, sometimes this world can be pretty scary. Thank you for being a God I can always run to. I know you're always there for me. No matter how bad the storm is, I know you can calm it with just one word. That's very reassuring, isn't it? That's so good to remember. Okay, please do join me for a prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you that the wind and the waves obey you, Jesus. That we might struggle to understand it, that you were fully human when you were on earth and fully God. We thank you for this amazing thing that you are human and God at the same time. And it means that you are powerful, you are almighty, and it means that we can trust you to help us when we are in the storm. We might be struggling at the minute, going through some difficult times. It might be school, it might be friendships, it might be family, it might be worries, it might be concerns. Whatever our troubles are, we run to you, Jesus. We know that you can calm the storm, and we ask you that you would help us to trust you, help us to run to you, and help us to feel your presence and know that you are helping us in our times of trouble, in our stormy times. Thank you, Jesus, that you are always there for us to run to. Amen. Well, I hope you have a great rest of the week and last couple of days in school. It's a shame the weather's not so great now, isn't it? It's getting colder and it's getting damp. So I hope that you also stay nice and warm and stay nice and dry. So until Friday for our last story time together, take care, stay safe, and I will see you then. Bye everyone.